Thank you very much. So, effectively, this budget's now been announced 4 times in 4 different ways. On the 13th of May, you had the main budget. On the 18th of June, you announced a bunch of different changes for small businesses. 23 June, you announced the self-managed super fund thing. 25th of June today, you announced you're not going to do the death and divorce tax. So, on what basis is the original regulatory impact analysis actually valid? Which model of these 4 budgets did you actually cost?
Minister. Well, another wonderful contribution from Senator Bragg. Cynical, treats it like it's a bit of a joke, a bit funny, a bit schoolboy, a bit university. This is significant and serious tax reform. You might find it funny and entertaining. We flagged on budget night that there would be further consultations in a number of areas. We are doing that. We flagged on budget night that there would be several pieces of legislation.
Before we continue, do us a little favour by subscribing to the channel, because over 98% of you watching haven't subscribed. It costs you nothing, not even a penny, to join this channel. Have you subscribed? Thanks so much.
Not changed. The arrangements and the budget we tabled is the tax reform we are proceeding with some amendments that we have responded to. Now, either you don't respond to ideas that come forward and then you're criticised for not responding. Where we can reach agreement and make sensible adjustments to the overall package, you criticise us for that. One might think that maybe you don't support this overall tax reform, Senator Bragg, and that you're going to criticise whatever happens, and you'll see it in the cynical lens that the opposition has chosen to view this important reform. As someone who's so fixed on housing, and you are, you've been focused on this in the last term and this term. A shame that you weren't as focused in the government that you were a member of when they built about 370 social and affordable housing properties over a decade. Could have done with your level of interest that you have now then, when you were actually in a position to make decisions and deliver on them. But anyway, put that aside. I would have thought, if you weren't a member of the Liberal Party, you would support these changes to negative gearing capital gains tax, because you know that what we say is true, that the distortion that exists in the housing market and its intersection with the tax system at the moment is not working in the interests of every Australian. Now, it may be working in the interests of some, and that's fine. Those laws are there and the arrangements are there as they are today. But when these laws change, we think it will be a better and fairer system for a lot more people. And I think, because I've watched you on housing and I listen to what you say on it, I can't reconcile your focus on housing in this country as a key, economic and social priority, and your opposition to these changes. I just can't reconcile them, and so therefore I have to think that you probably don't think that. It's just because you're over there that you have to take this political position. But it's really, really clear that first home buyers, younger generations, have been competing with investors for established housing in this country, and they have often lost out because they are not able to avail themselves of the concessional treatment that the laws currently allow to compete on a level playing field. And we think that's wrong. We think the status quo, the system as it stands now, the status quo that you seek to protect, is broken. And these reforms tackle that. And so this is the budget we tabled on budget night. These are the laws that we're debating that relate to those decisions. We've made adjustments where they're sensible and reasonable and affordable to do so. We think that's a good thing, a government that listens and responds, and we will bring forward further legislation to implement the full package over this calendar year.
Senator Bragg, were you wanting to?
Yes.
Yep. I'll come to you, Senator Hanson.
Look,
Senator Bragg.
I mean, in the interest of time, and given that the minister wants to make political speeches, I'll just note a few things for the record, because I think this is an important process of our parliament. So, what we don't have as it stands, given you want to pass this bill today, is any sense of what the definition of a new bill would be. I know you flagged that it will be in future legislation, but I would have thought that if you're going to crow about some sort of a tax reform on housing, that the housing tax reform, noting the bunny ears here, an indication of my view that it's not really a reform, because $77 billion in new taxes is not actually tax reform. When you leave the country with the highest pay-as-you-go system and the highest capital gains tax system in the English-speaking world, but I note that we have no sense of what a definition of a new bill would be, which I would have thought would be pretty germane to this endeavour, but apparently that's not. The other thing that we also don't have is any explanation as to the question I asked before when I received a political torrent in relation to the regulatory impact analysis, which version of this budget was actually put through the analysis.
Canberra witnessed another explosive political showdown this week, and this time the battle wasn't over immigration, defence or energy. Instead, it centred on one of the issues that affects every Australian household sooner or later: taxes, housing, and whether the government's latest package truly deserves to be called tax reform. What began as a committee hearing quickly evolved into a fierce exchange between Senator Andrew Bragg and Finance Minister Katy Gallagher, with both sides accusing the other of misunderstanding what Australia needs at a time when housing affordability and cost of living pressures remain front and centre. From the very beginning, Senator Bragg made it clear he wasn't interested in political slogans. He argued that the government had effectively announced its housing tax package multiple times over several weeks, with changes, amendments and policy adjustments emerging after the original budget was handed down. His central question was straightforward but politically significant. If the package has changed repeatedly since budget night, how can the original modelling and regulatory analysis still accurately reflect what Parliament is now being asked to consider? That question immediately put Minister Gallagher on the defensive. Rather than accepting Bragg's criticism, she argued the government's overall reform package had remained consistent, while consultations had naturally resulted in adjustments and refinements along the way. According to the minister, governments should be prepared to listen to feedback, improve legislation where appropriate, and continue consulting stakeholders rather than refusing to adapt. In her view, responding to concerns demonstrated responsible government rather than policy confusion. But Bragg wasn't convinced. He argued that the repeated announcements created uncertainty for investors, businesses and Australians trying to understand exactly what the government's housing tax reforms would look like. More importantly, he challenged whether it was appropriate for Parliament to debate legislation before several key definitions and implementation details had been fully settled. That is where the confrontation became particularly interesting. Bragg wasn't simply criticising individual tax measures, he was questioning the process itself. If Parliament is being asked to support major reforms, should legislators already know precisely how important definitions will operate? Should modelling reflect the final package rather than earlier versions? And should governments provide greater clarity before asking Parliament to approve legislation? Those questions quickly shifted the debate away from politics and toward governance. Minister Gallagher defended the government's approach, arguing that the overall objectives had never changed. She maintained that the reforms were designed to improve housing affordability, encourage additional housing supply, and create a fairer taxation system over time. She also argued that consultations were always intended to continue after the budget, with additional legislation addressing implementation details as the reforms progressed. Yet Bragg returned to one phrase that immediately captured attention. He argued that describing the package as tax reform overlooked what he viewed as a substantial increase in taxation. In his view, Australians were being asked to accept significant new tax measures under the banner of reform without sufficient explanation of their broader economic consequences. That criticism rapidly became one of the most widely discussed moments from the hearing. Within hours, political commentators began debating whether the government's housing package should primarily be viewed as tax reform, housing reform, or revenue raising. Economists offered differing assessments. Property analysts examined the potential effects on investment decisions. Tax specialists debated the likely behavioral impacts. Social media quickly filled with competing interpretations from supporters and critics alike. What made the exchange resonate so strongly was its connection to issues already dominating public discussion. Housing affordability continues to challenge first home buyers across Australia. Rental markets remain tight in many cities and regional centres. Construction costs remain elevated. Population growth continues placing pressure on supply. Against that backdrop, any proposal affecting property investment, taxation, or housing development inevitably attracts intense scrutiny. Bragg repeatedly returned to concerns about certainty. He questioned how developers, investors, and home buyers could confidently make long-term decisions if important legislative definitions remained under consultation. He also pressed the government on modelling that predicted changes to housing supply, asking how Treasury had reached its conclusions and whether alternative scenarios had been fully considered. Minister Gallagher responded by pointing to Treasury analysis contained within the budget papers. She argued the government's modelling anticipated additional first home buyers entering the market while also supporting further housing construction through complementary infrastructure investments. According to the minister, the reforms formed part of a broader housing strategy rather than operating in isolation. That distinction became one of the defining themes of the hearing. The government argued the reforms should be assessed as part of an integrated package addressing housing supply, affordability, and infrastructure simultaneously. Bragg argued individual components deserved much closer scrutiny before Parliament proceeded. Neither side gave an inch. As the debate intensified, broader political implications began emerging. Housing has become one of Australia's defining political issues. Every major party acknowledges affordability remains a serious challenge. The disagreement increasingly centres not on whether action is necessary, but on what form that action should take. Should governments rely more heavily on tax incentives, planning reform, infrastructure investment, direct construction, market intervention, or some combination of all four? Those competing philosophies were on full display throughout the exchange. Outside Parliament, reactions were immediate. Supporters of the government's approach argued Australia needs structural reform to improve housing affordability for younger generations. Others agreed with Bragg that legislation of this scale requires maximum transparency, particularly when taxation changes could influence investment decisions for decades. Business groups, economists, and housing advocates continued offering differing perspectives as the debate unfolded throughout the week. Some focused on encouraging additional housing supply. Others emphasised tax neutrality. Still others argued planning restrictions, construction delays, and infrastructure shortages remain even more significant than taxation policy. That diversity of opinion demonstrates why housing reform remains one of the most complex policy challenges facing any Australian government. International comparisons also entered the conversation. Countries across the developed world continue wrestling with many of the same pressures. Housing affordability has become a defining issue in Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and parts of Europe. Governments everywhere are searching for policies capable of improving affordability without undermining investment or reducing future supply. Australia now finds itself confronting those same difficult trade-offs. Back inside the hearing room, however, the political battle remained focused on accountability. Bragg repeatedly sought greater detail regarding definitions, modelling assumptions, and implementation timelines. Gallagher maintained that consultation was continuing appropriately while defending Treasury's overall analysis and the government's policy objectives. The exchange gradually evolved into something larger than a disagreement over housing taxes. It became a debate about how governments design major reforms. Should every detail be finalised before legislation reaches Parliament, or should governments continue refining policy as consultation progresses? Reasonable people may disagree, but few would dispute that Australians expect clarity whenever major tax changes are proposed. For ordinary Australians watching the exchange, the practical concerns remain straightforward. Will these reforms make buying a home easier? Will they increase or reduce housing supply? Will rents become more affordable? Will younger Australians have better opportunities to enter the market? Those questions matter far more than political slogans. They affect families planning their futures. They affect retirees considering investments. They affect builders deciding whether to commence new projects. They affect every Australian hoping housing becomes more affordable over time. As Parliament continues debating these proposals, the political stakes remain enormous. Housing affordability consistently ranks among the country's most important public policy challenges. Every major announcement now receives immediate attention because Australians recognise how directly these decisions affect their financial future. This week's confrontation demonstrated exactly why. Senator Bragg challenged the government's process, modelling and characterisation of its reforms. Minister Gallagher defended the government's consultation, objectives and broader housing strategy. Neither side persuaded the other, but both highlighted the enormous importance of getting housing policy right, because ultimately, Australians are less interested in political point scoring than practical outcomes. They want more homes. They want greater affordability. They want confidence that today's decisions will improve tomorrow's housing market. Whether these reforms ultimately achieve those objectives remains a matter of political debate and future evidence. One thing, however, is already certain. Housing will remain at the very centre of Australian politics for years to come. So what do you think? Did Senator Bragg raise legitimate questions about the government's modelling and consultation process? Has Minister Gallagher made a convincing case that the reforms will improve affordability? And what should Australia prioritise most? Tax reform, increased housing supply, planning reform, or a combination of all three? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Australian politics, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with friends and family. With Parliament continuing to debate some of the biggest economic decisions facing the country, there will be many more political battles still to come.